Hey guys, welcome back to Gatsu Gaming. Today we're going to be talking about Unholy Death Knight. This is one of the most requested things I've seen so far just in general in the comments, so I figured I'd go ahead and make a stop here next. One of the biggest changes to Unholy Death Knight is that there actually aren't a whole lot of changes. The reason I say it that way is because we were supposed to get a lot of sweeping changes to Death Knights, and in the case of Unholy, those never actually really came, which is pretty cool. So let's take a quick look at the Unholy Death Knight as it moves towards BFA launch. Now with our talents here, they are all pretty similar to what they were before. You will notice that you have lost Gargoyle Baseline. That is no longer an ability you have. Baseline is now a talent. And for the most part, most of our abilities as an Unholy Death Knight are now focused primarily around either our singular disease or our bursting spores. Bursting sores. Sores. Pestilent spores? Festering wounds. That's it. Festering wounds. Words are very hard today. Alright, so the level 56 row, we have Infected Claws. Your ghoul's claw attack has a 30% chance to cause a festering wound against the target. This is probably your best option most of the time, as this will give you that extra festering wound, which gives you that haste buff depending on how you are set up, and just in general will help you do a little bit of extra damage and maintain stacks of that debuff. This entire row here is essentially passive with the exclusion of Clawing Shadows, which is more utility than anything. But this will normally be your go-to, at least as far as tuning goes right now. All Will Serve is a pretty interesting talent in that it gives you a second pet. It typically gives you, I believe, a Skeletal Archer. While I like this talent, unfortunately the damage it does so far is pretty minuscule, so it's really not worth taking right now. Depending on what we get as far as Azurite traits that might modify this, that could change, and this one could be a good bit stronger. But for the time being, steer clear of All Will Serve. This one won't really help you out all that much. The last one here in the row is Clawing Shadows. Clawing Shadows replaces Scourge Strike for you. Remains the cost of 1 rune. It gives it a 30-yard range to pop those festering wounds. So any fight where you're going to have ads that are fairly spread out, or if you're just going to need some extra range due to some mechanic, Clawing Shadows could be the option you should take. This does also convert all the damage from your Scourge Strike from physical damage and shadow damage to just pure shadow damage. So if there is some kind of a gimmick fight where magic doesn't do as much, or rather magic does all of the damage and physical is heavily mitigated, Clawing Shadows could be the go-to there. So do keep that in mind if you're swapping that talent, that you will be changing damage types. Clawing Shadows, of course, will then actually benefit from your mastery significantly more than standard Scourge Strike would. 57 row here, we have Bursting Sores. Festering Wounds deal 25% more damage when they burst, and all enemies within 8 yards of the burst of Festering Wounds suffer a little bit of shadow damage. I wasn't too impressed with Bursting Sores at first, until I realized just how synergetic all of the talents that reference Festering Wounds truly are. This gives you a lot of on-demand AoE, as well as just consistent AoE. So this is a very good general talent, and will most likely see a lot of use in dungeons, regardless of which spec you actually end up playing. Ebon Fever here, Virulent Plague deals 15% more damage over time in half the duration. So I believe what this does is it actually either front loads it or tucks it back to the half end there. It gives another 15% damage in there. It also shortens the duration there. I may not fully be understanding how this one works here, because Virulent Plague is something that's kind of new to me. I haven't played with Unholy Death Knight as a main in quite some time. The last one here is Unholy Blight. Surround yourself with a vile swarm of insects for 6 seconds, stinging all nearby enemies and inflicting them with an unholy disease that deals 35-49 damage over 14 seconds. Unholy Blight is very good if you need a very powerful on-demand AoE dot / burst for It's hard to quantify what this actually is really going to do for you in most groups. It's a really good skill. It does a ton of damage, but unless you're going to have a ton of targets to use this with, you probably won't get much of a chance to use it. So keep that in mind with Unholy Blight, that unless you have a very specific target, it's not going to be the talent you pick over Bursting Sores, and if you need damage quicker, Ebon Fever is probably still the choice there as well. So not too sure where Unholy Blight fits in everything, but I know it is quite a bit of damage when you are pulling very, very large. I'm sure there's some kind of a target cap, like if, if you have 3 or less targets, take X talent. If you have 3 to 7, take this one. If you have way, way more than that, then you take the other. But again, I'm no expert on Death Knight. Check out the Arceus Discord for more information on that. They're a great place for Death Knight info. I'll link it in the description. The 58 here, we have Grip of the Dead. Death and Decay reduces the movement speed of enemies within its area by 90%, and it decays 10% every second. This gives Death and Decay a really massive snare, and makes it incredibly strong. So getting away from mobs kiting during necrotic weeks, this is definitely going to be your go-to for that, as they have gotten rid of that debilitating plague talent that we had before, which just gave us a baseline snare on our disease. This is the one I take most of the time, as I don't really need the stun, and if I'm soloing, though, I will take Death's Reach just to have that reset every time something dies. But in most mythic situations, Grip of the Dead will be what you take to help with the tank, unless you have someone else that can provide a consistent snare, in which case then you would probably take Asphyxiate, which lifts the target off the ground and stuns them for 4 seconds. This is super powerful when you need that extra stun, or when you just need a stun in general, because stuns have been very much reduced across the board. This one's still 4 seconds, so very powerful on a 45-second cooldown. And again, Death's Reach, that just increases the range of your Death Grip by 10 yards, and anytime you kill an enemy that yields experience or honor, it resets its cooldown. I love this talent when soloing because I always have Death Grip up, which lets me avoid pulling 12 mobs at a time. Although at this point I feel Unholy can actually probably handle 12 mobs at one time. Better to be safe than sorry. So level 60 here, we have some very interesting talents indeed. We have Pestilent Pustules. Try to say that 10 times fast. Bursting a Festering Wound has a 10% chance to grant you Runic Corruption. Runic Corruption, of course, is your runic generation there, your rune regen, etc. So this just gives you a 10% chance to grab that effect that you would normally get from using Death Coil. This is super helpful in smoothing out your rotation, but typically I prefer Harbinger of Doom. Sudden Doom is a proc you can get, which we'll go over momentarily in the spellbook. And Sudden Doom triggers 15% more often and can accumulate up to 2 charges. This is incredibly powerful indeed, and just lets you bank 1 so that you don't end up... I keep clicking that guy through my window here, and that's so frustrating. But Harbinger of Doom is my pick, just because I like having a little more than one option. It's harder to waste one that way. Soul Reaper, rip out the enemy's soul, dealing shadow damage over 8 seconds. If the enemy that yields experience or honor dies while affected by Soul Reaper, you get 10% haste for 8 seconds. This does generate 2 runes regardless. So here you just have basically your runic generation row. Soul Reaper is very powerful, especially if you're able to make sure you get that out there right before an enemy dies or in the last couple of seconds, as it will go ahead and get you that haste, which makes you do even more damage. As long as you're coordinated and confident enough you can do this, Soul Reaper is definitely the best pick here. If not, Pestilent Pustules or Harbinger of Doom are both very good options and will serve you well. The 75 row here, we have Spell Eater. Anti-Magic Shell absorbs 30% more magic damage and lasts 5 seconds longer. So if you have some sort of an ability you're trying to soak, or if there's just constant poison damage, something like that, popping your Anti-Magic Shell, giving it a little bit more oomph is always a good idea. This is one of the few defensives that we have as an Unholy Death Knight, so to be able to buff that and make it last even longer is definitely a welcome addition. Wraithwalk here is actually now a talent. It's very awkward to see it here since we just had it. This does still remove all root effects and increases your movement speed by 70%. Makes your max movement speed, or rather, it takes your movement speed up to 170, and you cannot be reduced below that. The best part about this is that if you need to move very quickly, Wraithwalk will be your pick, bar none, because Death's Advance is nowhere close. But this also locks you out of DPSing, whereas Death's Advance will allow you to continue doing your damage rotation. So if you absolutely need Wraithwalk, or if you're just more comfortable with it, you can still take it. But you probably have better options in the case of Spell Eater or even Death Pact. Death Pact is a 2-minute CD, creates a Death Pact that heals you for 50% of your max health, but absorbs incoming healing equal to 30% of your max health for 15 seconds. This is also very useful when you are soloing, just to get that quick heal up. Unfortunately, this is not a very short cooldown at 2 minutes, so it's not the greatest either when you're leveling, but it still helps. And this can also help your healer in Mythic Plus if you know there's going to be heavy damage or some affix during a week where you don't have to worry about healing as much. Even if you want to run without a healer, Death Pact works really well with that because you can just Death Strike back up if you need to. The level 90 row is all about AoE. So here we have Pestilence. Death and Decay damage has a 10% chance to apply a Festering Wound to the enemy. If you are going with that full-on Festering Wounds build, this is definitely the talent you're going to take. Getting those extra wounds out there, getting them on multiple targets, of course, is going to be incredibly useful. And just having 1 or 2 up there for you to burst as you tab target through with Clawing Shadows even, can be really, really awesome and useful. Defile replaces your Death and Decay, and also takes the cooldown from 30 seconds down to 20 seconds. That's a very important distinction to know, is that Death and Decay right now is a 30-second cooldown, whereas Defile is shorter. Defile hits the ground, it does a moderate amount of shadow damage over 10 seconds to every enemy that stands within it. While you're standing in your Defile, your Scourge Strike will hit all enemies near the target. So this gives you effective cleave while you're in there, as does Death and Decay. However, if enemies are standing in the Defile, it grows in size every second. So if enemies are a little more spread out and it's going to be a light spread, Defile will definitely help you make sure you're cleaving everything you possibly can. Epidemic is very, very powerful AoE burst. This does cost 30 runic power, so it is a little difficult to get going at times. But what this does is it causes any virulent plague that's out there on any enemy to flare up. It deals 725 shadow damage to that enemy, and then it does an AoE around that enemy for about a little less than half of what it would have originally done. And that's to every enemy within range. So if you have, say, 12 enemies together, and you pop Outbreak, and all 12 of those enemies have it, and then you pop Epidemic, that is a massive, massive spike in damage. And it will just blow you away at just how much that does and how quickly it does it. Epidemic is very powerful when you're pulling super, super big, and you need burst right away. Again, if you're banking runic power, much easier to deal with. If you're starting from scratch, you need a couple GCDs to get it built up so you can start doing so. Now, our final row here is essentially our big cooldowns. Some people are going to be excited to see some of these. Some people are going to look at them and go, where's my Valkyrie? Starting off here, you have Army of the Damned. Death Coil reduces the cooldown of Apocalypse by 1 second, and Army of the Dead, by 5 seconds. Now this here is essentially the tier bonus, I believe, from Tomb of Sargeras, if I'm not mistaken. It was one of the most enjoyable playstyles for Unholy last expansion when I played it as a hobby, so to speak. It was like my 3rd or 4th ult, somewhere around there. I really enjoyed that playstyle because it actually let you use Army of the Dead more than once, once, maybe twice a dungeon. So it was nice to see it. I'm glad it's here as an option. It is passive, so it is a little boring, but it does bring Apocalypse up significantly more often, and when paired with Harbinger of Doom, it is incredibly powerful. Unholy Frenzy essentially gives us a nearly personal heroism every 1.3 minutes. It incites you into Killing Frenzy for 12 seconds, giving you 20% haste, and causing your auto attacks to infect the target with Festering Wound. Now this here, of course, goes and pairs very well with all of the Festering Wound talents. In fact, when I have this active with the setup I'm running right now, I am actually constantly capping on Festering Wounds so much quicker than I thought I would, that I'm actually looking to take out Infected Claws and move over to All Will Serve, which almost contradicts one of my earlier points, but it's just because of the speed they're going up right now. I'm assuming that after tuning, that'll tone down just slightly, because I don't think we're supposed to have 6 wounds all the time on one target. But in an AoE situation, Unholy Frenzy is incredible. Just getting that 20% haste for your dots, if nothing else, is pretty impressive. Now, Summon Gargoyle is a little iffy right now. Just like how Storm Elemental is for Elemental Shaman at the moment, I don't see Summon Gargoyle being that great early on, just because in order to get where he needs to be, you have to spend quite a bit of runic power. If you have a full bar, you can pump him up pretty high. As long as your runic gen is good and quick and you're getting some good procs, maybe during hero, he's going to hit like a freight train. Unfortunately, this also locks you out of having Unholy Frenzy or Army of the Damned. So he is basically your, if you have one phase where you have to burn, he's definitely your talent pick for sure. I personally have stayed away from Gargoyle. I used it once or twice in dungeons just to test it, and while it does do good damage, I've just found that Unholy Frenzy or Army of the Damned at the moment just jump a little bit ahead of it with the generation we have currently. So taking a quick peek at our spellbook here, not much has changed for the most part. Still have Anti-Magic Shell. It absorbs about 17,000 magic damage and prevents the application of harmful magic effects. Damage absorbed does generate runic power, so you can definitely still stand in the fire. Very, very useful in most dungeons. There's almost always an effect that will do something to you where you want to go ahead and get away from it, or, you know, you can stand there and use AMS to cheese it and generate more runic power during your gargoyle, for instance. We have Apocalypse baseline now, 1.5 minute CD. Brings doom on the enemy, dealing shadow damage and bursting up to 4 festering wounds on the target. Summons an Army of the Dead Ghoul for 15 seconds for each bursted festering wound. With the Azurite traits, this Apocalypse version that we have now is very, very strong. And this is your, you know, your short DPS cooldown. If you take Army of the Damned, you're going to be popping this every single CD you get. It's around a 1 minute cooldown or so at that point, rather than a minute 30. And it lines up very, very well with most of your other CDs because of it. Army of the Dead just summons your ghouls. Costs you 3 runes. Is an 8 minute cooldown baseline with Army of the Damned. It's up, I think, roughly every 5 or so minutes. Pretty impressive damage out of it as well, especially during hero. We have Chains of Ice here. It's just a snare at this point. It doesn't do any damage anymore, which is completely fine. But it is a 70% snare for 8 seconds, which is very, very powerful. It does cost you a rune, so be sure you don't rune starve yourself for some reason spamming this. With the amount of undead we have, Control Undead is very powerful. It says up to level 112 on this because this character is only 111. I've exclusively done dungeons on this character due to a wonderful glitch I found, where I can't actually complete the opening quests for whatever reason. So I'm running around questless at the moment, which is why I'm only 111. But this lets you steal an undead creature to be your minion for 5 minutes. Incredibly useful in Waycrest Manor if you find the right trapper early on and get to use it. More Death Knights need to use Control Undead because they don't realize either they have it, they've forgotten they have it, or they don't realize you can steal the mob. There's a lot of places in Legion even where this is incredibly strong, especially Blackrook Hold, where you can potentially snag a Lancer and have him stun an entire trash pack for you. So many applications for this that I think a lot of people have missed, so be sure you're trying this out on every mob you encounter, and checking its abilities, just to see if there's something you can use to get some big numbers out of it. We have an ability here, it's called Corpse Exploder. 30-yard range, causes a target corpse to explode in a shower of gore. Does not affect mechanical or elemental corpses. I believe this is an ability that I got from my class hall in Legion. I copied this character over. I haven't had a chance to make another character here on beta that is a character that's not a character copy. But if you don't have this, you should go get it. It's pretty cool to just blow up corpses for no reason. Dark Command. Command the target to attack you, increasing threat you generate against the target for 3 seconds. You won't use this too often when you just want to pull something random or when you need to save the tank from necrotic stacks. Dark Command's the only thing you've got, really, besides Death Grip. And Dark Command will do the job. Dark Transformation, this is your baseline 1-minute cooldown. Swaps your ghoul into an undead monstrosity for 15 seconds. The ghoul's abilities are empowered and take on new functions while the transformation is active. You're going to use this every single chance you get on cooldown. It's very, very rare you would not use this on cooldown just because your ghoul is almost always going to be attacking the right target. Death and Decay, shadow damage over 10 seconds within that area. Makes your Scourge Strike hit all the enemies near that target whenever you use it. Super powerful AoE tool, and definitely something you need to make sure you're using as much as possible, especially if you take the Snare talent. Death Coil is our runic power dump. 30-yard range, 40 runic power, fires a blast of unholy energy at the target, causing shadow damage, and it also reduces the cooldown of Dark Transformation by 1 second. With Sudden Death grants you a free instant cast, well, not instant, it's always instant cast, but a free Death Coil, and you should make sure you're always using those, because it will reduce that Dark Transformation cooldown. This, again, is our runic dump, so anytime you're close to full, you want to make sure you're Death Coiling to keep up your runic corruption as well. Deathgate just returns you to Ebb and Hold, so you can go ahead and pop on those awesome rune forges that some people may have forgotten they have, because they probably haven't rune forged their weapons in about 2 years at this point. Do remember that you have those rune forges, and you want to make sure they're on your weapons. Just throwing that out there for some people like Leah, who just realized you could rune forge both of your frost weapons. It's pretty cool. Death Grip, 25-second cooldown, 30-yard range. Play Scorpion, grab that random mob over there and pull it towards you. Super useful for getting things out of Sanguine. You can use it as an interrupt sometimes for mobs you normally can't interrupt. It has a lot of very useful applications, and you should definitely use it more often. So here on page 2, we've got Death Strike. This is our oh shit heal button. Strikes the target for physical damage and heals you for 45% of all damage taken in the last 5 seconds, minimum of 15% of your maximum health. It is very difficult not to have the runic power for this unless you're in an active like dump spree with your Death Coil. You shouldn't need to use Death Strike too often, but when you need to, make sure you've taken damage in the last 5 seconds so you get more than that baseline 15% health. Death's Advance replaces our Wraith Walk as our baseline movement. It's still a 45-second cooldown. For 8 seconds, your movement speed is increased by 30%, and you cannot be slowed below 100% of normal movement speed. You're also immune to forced movement effects and knockbacks. So essentially, on, say, Mythic Kill Jaden, Death's Advance would keep you from getting knocked around. Super powerful ability, but not one that has too many applications in Legion, besides that KJ fight on Mythic. In BFA, however, there's a lot of mechanics that'll knock you around, so Death's Advance is incredibly useful. Festering Strike, this is our standard runic dump, so to speak, or rune dump, rather. It's our main generator. Strikes the target for 2,000 physical damage and infects the target with 2 to 3 festering wounds. It is kind of a little bit RNG. And those festering wounds will put a Pustulant Lesion that will burst on death, or... Excuse me, I just sneezed there. A Pustulant Lesion that will burst on death or when damaged by Scourge Strike, dealing 939 shadow damage and generating 3 runic power. Again, this is just our standard runic power ability. We build up our wounds. When we have our wounds built up, we shift over to Scourge Strike and pop them. Icebound Fortitude, this is our 30% shield wall. It does grant you immunity to stun effects. This is incredibly useful whenever you just need to survive, or whenever you know there's an incoming group-wide stun, you can completely avoid it. Tol Dagor is a great example of that, if you've done that dungeon. Mind Freeze, this is our standard interrupt. 15-second cooldown, 15-yard range. No longer has a cost on it, thank goodness. It is a 3-second lockout on that spell school. Outbreak. Outbreak deals a little bit of shadow damage and surrounds the target in a miasma for 6 seconds. It infects nearby enemies with Virulent Plague. Virulent Plague is a disease that deals a good bit of shadow damage over 10 seconds and erupts when the infected target dies, dealing shadow damage divided among nearby enemies, and has a 30% chance to erupt each time it deals damage. You want to make sure your Virulent Plague is always up on every single target it can be up on. This is just an absolutely astronomical amount of your damage when you maintain it correctly. Path of Frost. Anytime you want to troll your party or raid members by, jumping off of a cliff, not having it on, and then popping it on yourself while they jump and fall to their deaths, there you go. Path of Frost. Every Death Knight from Lich King in Trial of the Crusader says hello. Raise Ally, your battle res, 10-minute cooldown. Of course, that changes in Mythic Plus to be a 10-minute recharge. Picks them up instantly. It does cost 30 runic power. And it is 60% health and 20% mana. Raise Dead just brings your ghoul up for you. You can only have one ghoul at a time. This does have a 30-second cooldown, so if your ghoul is constantly dying, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know how that happened. Rune Forging, this is just our Rune Forge tab. Just opens up this interface here. It's nice and skinned with LVI. We used to have a lot more, now we just have the 3. We have Rune of Razor Ice, Rune of the Fallen Crusader, and Rune of the Stone Skin Gargoyle. There's an Unlearned tab here. I'm not sure why, because there's nothing here. But it is there. So we have just Razor Ice, which is for Frost, Fallen Crusader, which is for both, and then Stone Skin Gargoyle, which is pretty much only for tanks, although I believe most tanks still just go for Fallen Crusader. Scourge Strike, an Unholy Strike that deals 618 physical damage and 598 shadow damage. Causes 1 festering wound on the target to burst. Scourge Strike is whenever we don't need to Festering Strike, we Scourge Strike. When we don't have any more wounds, we Festering Strike. If you're not sensing the pattern yet, start the video over and give me another view. So we have a couple passives here. Dark Sucker. When you kill an enemy that yields experience or honor, your next death strike within 20 seconds is free and heals for an additional 5% of maximum health. This is a wonderful proc while you are leveling to make sure your next death strike is not going to hamper your ability to deal a ton of damage, and getting that little bit more HP out of it is always welcome. The Mastery for Unholy is still just pure shadow damage. It scales incredibly well for us here. I don't actually have all that much Mastery for an Unholy Death Knight, but just having 75% increased damage on anything sounds really good. On a Pale Horse, you get 20% extra mounted speed. Simple as that. Runic Corruption, this is popped whenever we go and anytime you spend Runic Power, typically with Death Coil, your Runic Power has a 1.4% chance to increase your Runic regeneration rate by 100% for 3 seconds. Runic Corruption is up significantly more often than you would think. Now, your typical Death Coil is 40 Runic Power. Because it is each Runic Power you spend, that is 40 times 1.4. So nearly 50% chance just to always have this up every time you Death Coil. You can keep it up significantly more often than you would think, and if you haven't gotten Runic Corruption in a while, you should probably look at your Runic bar, because you're probably full. And the last one here is Sudden Doom. Your auto attacks have a chance to make your next Death Coil cost no Runic Power. This is that proc. With the talent that I chose, I can have 2 stacks of this, which is great. It helps a lot when you need to tab target to hit things, or to grab another mob when you're leveling. Sudden Doom in general is a really cool mechanic. It's one of the few procs we have as an Unholy Death Knight. Going over the pet real quick, just because he is here. Pet's pretty boring though. He has Claw, just deals basic physical damage. You don't really have to turn anything off on him. Claw just deals basic physical damage when he's transformed via Dark Transformation. He rakes with Deformed Claws and deals shadow damage instead to all nearby enemies as well. Gnaw is it says bite and tear the target's limbs, dealing light damage and stunning them for 1 second. This is actually an ability you may want to turn off occasionally. I leave this on whenever I'm soloing just because I'm never going to stun the target myself since I don't run Asphyxiate. This, of course, will DR or this will cause diminishing returns on that type of CC in dungeons if you don't turn this off automatically, which you should, just like Taunt on a Hunter Pet. Dark Transformation makes him strike an enemy with a smashing attack, which deals a little bit of physical damage and stuns them for 2 seconds as opposed to 1. Just a slight increase there. So we have a Leap here. It just makes him jump to the target. It's how he gets into combat quick for you. And Dark Transformation, he charges the enemy, interrupts their spell casting, and immobilizes them for 2 seconds. This is super, super useful. This is something that I just leave on autocast because it's very rare that I'm ever not going to just let him do that. You can, however, toggle it and control it yourself if you would prefer. Huddle is something that is not auto usable. It is something you have to click yourself. What it does is it causes him to go into defensive crouch. It reduces all damage he takes by 50%, but it makes him unfortunately useless other than that. While he is transformed in Dark Transformation, he just reduces his damage taken by 50% and continues attacking. So while you are soloing, Huddle will make sure that he survives that elite a little bit longer while you get ready to resummon him, because obviously he's going to die probably shortly afterwards. He does take 80% less damage from area effects, and it reduces the range at which enemies detect your pet, which is great. A long time ago, pets used to pick up things from across instances randomly. They'd move too quick near a wall or something. It was a nightmare. Thankfully, Avoidance fixes all that. He has a basic auto attack, Who'da Thunk. You can always make him move somewhere to start somewhere as well, which is great. All in all, Unholy Death Knight is doing pretty solid damage at the moment before the tuning passes have really started. And it's kind of been one of the standouts for DPS in beta so far. I'm very thrilled with how the spec feels and how it plays currently. While it's not something that I would consider playing as my main spec because I am really not looking forward to playing a melee. As you can see here, there's some cool beta imagery for you there. A nice little invisible wall that I think can I walk through? Yeah, I can just walk under the road here. I'm not really looking towards playing an Unholy Death Knight. If you're looking for a strong melee that brings a little bit of utility to the group in the amount of a battle res, death grip, the snares with death and decay, the pet that can do some goofy stuff for you, Unholy Death Knight might be for you, and you should definitely check it out. That being said, thank you so much for tuning in today and sitting here with me so I could talk to you about Unholy Death Knight. If you liked the video, give it a like. If you didn't like it, dislike it. Let me know in the comments why. And yeah, I will see you guys in the next video. Catch you later.